My girlfriend's parents thought I was the scum of society, but when they found out who I really was, they were shocked. I've always preferred keeping a low profile. It's not that I'm hiding anything, I just don't see the need to flaunt what I have. I built my own tech company from the ground up, secured major contracts, and now I live more than comfortably. But I don't drive a flashy car or wear designer suits. I still shop at the same stores I always have, and my daily uniform consists of jeans and a hoodie. The last thing I want is for people to see my bank account before they see me. That's one of the reasons I fell for Emily. From the moment we met, she never cared about what I did for a living beyond normal curiosity. She never pried about my salary, never made comments about expensive gifts or luxury experiences. She genuinely liked me, and after a few months of dating, I was pretty sure she was the real deal. Her family, on the other hand, that was a different story. A few weeks ago, Emily invited me to dinner at her parents' house. She warned me they could be a little intense, which was a polite way of saying they were the kind of people who really cared about status. Her dad, Richard, had been in finance for decades, managing investments and rubbing elbows with wealthy executives. Her mom, Linda, was essentially a full-time socialite, her schedule filled with luncheons and charity events that were more about appearances than actual goodwill. And her brother? His name was Chad, which told me all I needed to know. I didn't mind meeting them. I figured it would be the usual kind of thing. Some small talk, a few protective dad questions, maybe a comment or two about my intentions with Emily. Nothing I couldn't handle. But from the moment I stepped through their front door, I knew this was going to be something else entirely. Richard barely acknowledged me at first, giving me a quick nod before turning his attention back to the expensive-looking scotch in his hand. Linda was polite, but distant, offering me a tight smile before walking off to fuss over the dinner preparations. Chad, meanwhile, sized me up like I was some intruder in his domain, lounging back on the couch with a smug expression that screamed entitlement. The small talk started off fine. They asked about how Emily and I met, what kind of things we like to do together, all the standard stuff. But the moment we sat down for dinner, the real interrogation began. "So, what do you do?" Richard asked, casually swirling his wine. His tone was neutral, but something about the way he asked it made it clear he was already judging whatever answer I gave. "I work in tech," I said, keeping it vague. It wasn't a lie. I just didn't feel like getting into details. That answer, apparently, wasn't good enough. Richard pressed for more specifics. What exactly did I do? What company did I work for? Where did I go to school? When I mentioned that I went to a state university, his lips actually curled in distaste, like I had just admitted to being a high school dropout. Chad let out a short laugh. "So what? Do you, fix computers or something?" he asked, clearly entertained by the idea. I felt Emily's hand squeeze mine under the table, a silent plea to stay calm. She was trying to keep the peace, but I could already tell that nothing I said would ever be good enough for her family. They had already decided I wasn't worth their time. And then Richard took it a step further. Right in front of me, not even bothering to lower his voice, he pulled Emily aside and told her she should consider dating someone wealthier. He even suggested a family friend she should meet, someone more suited to her lifestyle. That was the moment I decided I was done playing nice. I sat there, gripping my fork a little too tightly, as Richard whispered to Emily about how she should be with someone more suitable. He wasn't even trying to be subtle. The man literally suggested she meet up with some wealthy family friend, right in front of me, as if I wasn't even there. Emily looked horrified. She shot me an apologetic glance. But before she could say anything, Chad decided to pile on. "Look, man," he said, leaning back in his chair like he owned the place. "It's nothing personal. You seem fine and all, but, Emily's used to a certain lifestyle, you know? If you guys ever get serious, how are you going to keep up with that?" I almost laughed. The sheer arrogance of it all. The way they talked down to me, assuming I was some broke guy trying to date above my league. I could have shut them down right then and there, but I wanted to wait. Let them dig their own hole a little deeper. Richard smirked and leaned forward, clearly enjoying himself. "What exactly do you do in tech?" he asked, his tone dripping with condescension. "I run a company," I said, still keeping it vague. Richard raised an eyebrow. "A company?" He scoffed. "A startup, then?" "Something like that." Chad rolled his eyes. "Man, no offense, but everyone has a startup these days. That doesn't mean it's actually making money." Richard nodded in agreement. "It's a tough industry. Most fail within the first few years. What kind of revenue are you looking at?" I knew exactly what they were doing. They were trying to expose me, make me feel small, prove that I wasn't in the same financial stratosphere as them. And honestly, I was enjoying watching them walk straight into their own humiliation. Then Richard, ever the show-off, decided to brag about his latest big deal. "We just secured a massive investment from a major tech firm," he said, clearly proud of himself. "Biggest deal of the quarter. It's going to change the trajectory of the company." I tilted my head, feigning curiosity. "Oh, yeah? Which firm?" He named my company. The silence that followed was beautiful. For a second, Richard didn't realize what he just said. He was too caught up in his own ego. But Emily stiffened beside me, her eyes darting toward mine. She knew. She had known the whole time. I let the moment stretch, watching the slow realization creep onto Richard's face. "Oh," I said, finally breaking the silence. "That's interesting." I leaned back in my chair, resting my hands on the table. "Because I own that company." You could have heard a pin drop. Richard's face went completely pale. Chad, who had spent the entire dinner mocking me, suddenly looked like he wanted to disappear into his overpriced glass of wine. Linda, who had been mostly quiet up until now, actually gasped. I waited, letting them process it, watching as every insult, every smug comment, every assumption they had made about me came crashing down. If there's one thing I've learned in business, it's that silence is powerful. And in that moment, sitting at Richard's pristine dinner table, I let the silence stretch just long enough to watch them squirm. Richard blinked rapidly, like his brain was buffering. Chad's usual smug confidence had completely evaporated, and now he just looked lost. Linda, who had spent most of dinner acting like I barely existed, suddenly seemed very interested in me. Finally, Richard let out a forced chuckle, the kind people use when they're desperately trying to recover. "You're joking," he said, though he didn't sound convinced. Emily, who had been quiet during all of this, finally spoke. "He's not," she said simply. Richard's eyes snapped to her, then back to me. "Wait, you own—" I nodded, completely calm. "Yeah, that massive investment your company just secured. I signed off on it last month." I picked up my drink, taking a slow sip just to let it sink in further. For the first time all night, Richard had nothing to say. Chad, however, wasn't giving up so easily. "No way," he said, shaking his head. "You're messing with us." I shrugged. "Google me." Chad grabbed his phone like a lifeline, his fingers moving frantically. Within seconds, his face drained of color. He turned the screen toward Richard, who snatched it out of his hand and stared at the search results. My name, my company, my net worth. Richard let out a slow exhale, like he was physically deflating. I had no idea," he muttered. "No kidding." Suddenly, the energy in the room completely shifted. Just minutes ago, Richard had been grilling me, practically laughing at my state university degree and working-class background. Chad had been mocking the idea that I could keep up with Emily's lifestyle. Now they couldn't stop backpedaling. Richard straightened up, suddenly all business. "You know, I have heard great things about your company," he said, his tone a complete 180 from before. "Really impressive what you've built." Linda, who had barely spoken 2 words to me all night, finally jumped in. Emily mentioned you worked in tech, but she was so modest about it. You should have told us more about what you do. Chad forced a laugh, like we were all in on some big joke. Man, I was just messing with you earlier, he said, clearly desperate to rewrite history. Didn't mean anything by it. I wasn't buying any of it. Not for a second. These weren't people who had suddenly realized they'd misjudged me and wanted to make amends. No, this was something else entirely. This was damage control. They had spent the entire dinner treating me like I wasn't good enough for Emily, like I was some nobody they could write off. And now? Now they were scrambling to get back on my good side because they needed me. The worst part? I could see it in their eyes. They weren't sorry for how they had treated me. They were sorry they had treated me that way before they knew who I was. And that's when I decided I was done. Richard was still talking, trying to salvage what was left of his dignity. Something about potential partnerships and synergies between our companies. Chad had suddenly developed an intense interest in the tech industry, asking vague questions like, how did you even start a company like that? Linda had transformed into the doting hostess, offering me more wine, more food, more anything to keep me at that table. It was honestly pathetic. Just minutes ago, these people looked down on me. They mocked my education, dismissed my career, and even tried to convince Emily to date someone more suitable. And now? Now that they knew I had money, more money than them, they were practically falling over themselves to get on my good side. I could have played along. I could have smiled, let them grovel, enjoyed watching them scramble. But honestly, I was over it. I turned to Emily, who had been watching the whole thing unfold in silence, her expression unreadable. I think I've lost my appetite, I said simply. Her eyes flickered with understanding. Without hesitation, she grabbed her purse and stood up. Richard frowned, clearly thrown off. Wait, you're leaving? I met his gaze, keeping my voice calm but firm. Yeah, I came here thinking I was meeting Emily's family, not people who would judge me based on my bank account. Chad let out a nervous laugh. Come on, man, it's not like that. We were just... I cut him off with a look. He shut up immediately. Linda reached for another desperate attempt at damage control. Please, don't take it personally. It's just, you have to understand. We only want what's best for Emily. I let out a short, humorless laugh. Yeah, that much was obvious. Richard, still trying to regain some control, cleared his throat. Look, let's not make this into something it's not. You're clearly a very successful young man. I was just surprised, that's all. Surprised that someone who didn't fit his definition of wealthy could actually be successful. I didn't bother responding. I simply turned to Emily. You ready? She didn't hesitate. More than ready. We walked out together, leaving them sitting there in stunned silence. I could feel Richard's frustration, Chad's embarrassment, and Linda's quiet horror at how spectacularly the night had backfired on them. And honestly, it was perfect. The second we stepped outside, Emily let out a breath she had clearly been holding in. She glanced at me, searching my face for any sign of anger, frustration, something. Are you okay? She asked softly. I thought about it for a second. Was I? I had just walked out on what was supposed to be a normal family dinner, only to have it turn into some weird classist interrogation. But instead of feeling angry, I just felt relieved. I nodded. Yeah, just glad we left when we did. Emily looked down, biting her lip. I'm so sorry, she said, her voice laced with guilt. I knew they could be snobby, but I didn't think they'd be that awful. I reached for her hand, giving it a reassuring squeeze. You don't have to apologize for them, I said. This isn't on you. She nodded, but I could tell she still felt bad. We drove back to my place in comfortable silence, but as soon as we stepped inside, Emily turned to me again. I should have said something sooner, she admitted. When my dad started talking like that, I just froze. I was so embarrassed. I could see the frustration in her eyes, not just at them, but at herself. I shrugged. I get it. It's not easy standing up to family. She exhaled sharply. It's just, they don't get it. They've spent their whole lives in this bubble where money and status are everything. They assume everyone thinks the way they do. She shook her head. But what they don't realize is that they were the ones being judged tonight. And they failed? Miserably. I couldn't help but smirk at that. Yeah, they really did. She groaned, covering her face with her hands. Chad asking if you fix computers? I wanted to disappear. That actually made me laugh. That was the best part. You could see his brain short-circuiting when he realized who I was. Emily peeked at me from behind her hands, a small smile forming. You handled that way better than I would have. I shrugged. Honestly, it was kind of fun watching them self-destruct. Her smile faded a little. Do you think this changes things? I knew what she meant. She was worried about how this would affect us. So I answered her the only way I knew how. Honestly. Not between us, I said, but between me and your family? Yeah, a little. Because even though the night had ended on my terms, it still left a bad taste in my mouth. They hadn't just disrespected me. They had disrespected her, assuming she needed a man to take care of her. Assuming she couldn't think for herself. Assuming their opinion mattered. And now they had to sit with the knowledge that the person they had so easily dismissed was the same one holding all the power. I expected Richard to reach out eventually. I just didn't expect it to be the very next morning. Emily and I were having a quiet breakfast at my place when her phone buzzed. She glanced at the screen, sighed, and held it up for me to see. Dad, calling. I raised an eyebrow. You gonna answer? She rolled her eyes and hit decline. Not even a minute later, my phone lit up with an unknown number. I let it ring, knowing exactly who it was. Persistent, I muttered. Emily scoffed. He's panicking. Sure enough, a few seconds later, my voicemail pinged with a new message. I put it on speaker. Hey, this is Richard, Emily's father. His tone was a careful mix of forced politeness and barely hidden discomfort. Listen, I think we may have gotten off on the wrong foot last night. I'd love to have a proper conversation. Just us men, you know? Clear the air. Maybe discuss some business opportunities while we're at it. I almost laughed. Business opportunities? The man had spent the entire dinner treating me like I was beneath his daughter. And now he wanted to talk business? Emily groaned. Unbelievable. I shook my head. Not really. He's just trying to fix his mistake before it costs him. Because that's what this was about. Richard didn't suddenly regret how he treated me. He regretted who he had treated that way. The second he realized I was someone he could benefit from, his entire attitude shifted. And, honestly, I had no interest in playing that game. I deleted the voicemail without responding. Emily watched me, a small smile playing on her lips. That was satisfying. I smirked. Very. Over the next few days, Richard tried again. He texted Emily, asking her to talk some sense into me. He even emailed my assistant with a request for a friendly business meeting. Each attempt was more desperate than the last. I ignored them all. I wasn't interested in helping a man who only valued people based on their net worth. And I sure as hell wasn't going to pretend his behavior was acceptable just because he suddenly realized I was someone worth knowing. At the end of the day, I didn't need Richard's approval. I didn't need Chad's respect. And I definitely didn't need Linda's fake kindness. All I needed was Emily. And the best part? She had known the truth about me the entire time, and she had let her family expose themselves without saying a word. Now they had to live with that embarrassment. And honestly, that was revenge enough.